June 6, 1944. The Atlantic waves hammered against steel hulls as dawn broke over Normandy's blood-soaked beaches. And in those brutal opening minutes of Operation Overlord, a pattern emerged that would puzzle military historians. For decades, American soldiers stormed forward into withering German machine gun fire while their British and Canadian counterparts established defensive positions first. Lieutenant James McAllister of the 29th Infantry Division didn't pause to question doctrine as bullets tore through the air around him at Omaha Beach. He simply ran. Behind him, Corporal Eddie Ramirez from Texas followed, screaming encouragement over the deafening roar of artillery. Around them, men fell like wheat before a scythe, yet the Americans pressed forward with a ferocity that seemed to border on recklessness. 300 yards to the east, British Lieutenant Colonel David Harrington of the 6th Airborne Division observed the American advance through his field glasses with a mixture of admiration and concern. His own men had secured their landing zones methodically, establishing strong points and coordinating fire support before pushing inland. It was textbook warfare, the product of centuries of military tradition refined through 2 world wars. Yet watching the Americans charge headlong into fortified German positions, Harrington couldn't help but wonder if there was something fundamentally different in how these soldiers had been trained, or perhaps in something deeper, something cultural that defied conventional military wisdom. The answer lay not in the beaches of Normandy, but in the training camps scattered across the United States, in the philosophy of commanders who had studied America's military history, and in the national character forged through frontier expansion and revolutionary spirit. According to research published in the Journal of Military History in 1998, American tactical doctrine in World War II emphasized aggressive action and initiative at the lowest levels, a stark contrast to the more centralized command structures of European armies. This wasn't accident or oversight, it was deliberate strategy born from uniquely American experiences. Back at Omaha Beach, McAllister reached the seawall, his lungs burning, uniform soaked with seawater and blood that might have been his own or belonged to the private who'd been running beside him moments before. The German MG-42 machine guns continued their terrible symphony, firing at rates of 1,200 rounds per minute, creating zones of death that should have been impassable. Standard military doctrine suggested suppression, coordination, and combined arms wait for armor, wait for air support, wait for artillery to soften the enemy positions. But McAllister didn't wait. He pulled the pin on a grenade, counted to 2, and threw it toward the concrete bunker that had been decimating his company. The explosion was followed by screams in German, and suddenly there was a gap in the fire. "Move, move, move!" he shouted, and 20 men surged forward through that narrow window of opportunity. Some fell, but others made it to cover, and from there they could engage the next strong point. It was chaos, certainly, but it was aggressive chaos that kept the Germans reacting rather than methodically destroying the landing force. December 25, 1776. General George Washington stood on the banks of the Delaware River, ice floes grinding against each other in the darkness, and made a decision that violated every principle of 18th century warfare. His ragged Continental Army was supposed to winter in camp, as all civilized armies did. Instead, Washington ordered them into boats and across the freezing river to attack Hessian forces at Trenton. It was Christmas night. The enemy would be celebrating unprepared. The attack succeeded brilliantly, and more importantly, it established a precedent in American military culture when conventional wisdom said to wait. Americans attacked. This wasn't mere foolhardiness. Washington understood that his amateur army couldn't win a traditional war of position against professional European forces. His soldiers were farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who had volunteered to fight, not career soldiers drilled in parade ground precision. Their strength lay in mobility, initiative, and the willingness to take risks that would horrify traditional military thinkers. The success at Trenton demonstrated that aggressive action, even when technically disadvantageous, could achieve strategic results through sheer audacity and surprise. Fast forward to 1846, and the pattern repeated itself in the Mexican-American War. Captain Robert E. Lee, then a young engineer officer, participated in numerous reconnaissance missions that took him deep behind enemy lines. American forces under General Winfield Scott consistently attacked fortified Mexican positions rather than settling into siege warfare, which European doctrine would have demanded. At the Battle of Cerro Gordo, Scott flanked supposedly impassable terrain to attack the Mexican army's rear, a maneuver that Mexican General Santa Anna had deemed impossible. The Americans succeeded precisely because they attempted what seemed impossible. The frontier experience reinforced these tendencies throughout the 19th century. American settlers pushing westward couldn't wait for reinforcements or perfect conditions. They had to act decisively with limited resources against often superior numbers. Small groups of pioneers regularly defended themselves against raids by taking immediate counteraction rather than hunkering down and hoping for relief. This created a cultural expectation that when attacked, you fought back instantly and aggressively, not as a last resort but as a first response. By the time America entered World War I in 1917, this aggressive doctrine had become institutionalized in military training. General John Pershing insisted that American forces maintain their own sector of the Western Front rather than being absorbed into French or British command structures, partly because he recognized that American tactical approaches differed fundamentally from European methods. While Allied forces had adapted to trench warfare with its emphasis on massive preparatory bombardments and coordinated set-piece attacks, Pershing advocated for open warfare, emphasizing individual initiative and aggressive movement. The Battle of Belleau Wood in June 1918 exemplified this approach. When French forces began retreating before a German offensive, American Marines and soldiers of the 2nd Division not only held their ground but counterattacked immediately. Marine Captain Lloyd Williams famously responded to a French colonel's suggestion to retreat with the words, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." The Americans attacked through wheat fields under machine gun fire, suffering appalling casualties but ultimately stopping the German advance. French observers were shocked by the Americans' willingness to attack positions that European troops would have considered unassailable without extensive preparation. March 3, 1942. Camp Shelby, Mississippi sprawled across 85,000 acres of pine forests and red clay hills, transformed into a crucible where American soldiers learned to embrace calculated aggression. Sergeant First Class Michael O'Brien paced before a company of fresh-faced recruits, most barely old enough to shave, and delivered a lesson that differed markedly from what British or Canadian trainees heard across the Atlantic. "When you take fire," O'Brien barked, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd survived Belleau Wood, "you don't dive for cover and wait for someone to tell you what to do. You identify the threat, return fire, and assault through the objective. Hesitation gets people killed. Aggressive action saves lives." This wasn't rhetoric, it was codified doctrine. The United States Army's FM 22-5, the Basic Infantry Field Manual, explicitly stated that the spirit of the offensive must be developed until it becomes a dominating trait of character. Unlike British training that emphasized maintaining formation and awaiting orders, or Soviet doctrine that relied on mass and centralized control, American training focused on developing junior leaders who could make tactical decisions independently. Every sergeant was expected to think like a lieutenant, every private like a sergeant. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Harrison, an observer attached to British forces in North Africa, noted this difference in his reports back to Washington. He watched Commonwealth troops execute textbook defensive operations, establishing interlocking fields of fire and coordinating with artillery before advancing. It was professional, efficient, and methodical. Then he observed American forces at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where inexperienced U.S. troops faced veteran German panzers. The Americans took a beating initially, but their response to adversity revealed something fundamental even in defeat. They kept attacking, kept trying to seize initiative, sometimes disastrously, but always aggressively. The training reflected deeper philosophical differences about what made an effective soldier. British military tradition, honed over centuries, valued discipline, steadiness under fire, and the ability to execute complex maneuvers as part of a larger whole. The ideal British soldier was a professional who took pride in his regiment's history and reputation, fighting for king and country within established chains of command. This produced extraordinarily effective soldiers, but ones who naturally looked to leadership for direction before acting. American training, by contrast, emphasized individual initiative and problem-solving. Drill instructors regularly created scenarios where standard procedures wouldn't work, forcing trainees to improvise. Field exercises included deliberate chaos-changed orders, simulated officer casualties, unexpected enemy contact, all designed to prepare soldiers for independent action when communication broke down or circumstances changed rapidly. The underlying assumption was that war was inherently chaotic and that rigid adherence to plans would fail when contact with the enemy disrupted those plans. Captain James Roosevelt, the president's son serving with Marine raiders, experienced this firsthand during training at Jack Farm in California. Raiders were taught not just to follow orders but to understand the commander's intent, allowing them to adapt when situations changed. In one exercise, Roosevelt's squad was assigned to capture a hill. When they discovered the approach covered by machine guns, rather than requesting new orders, they independently flanked the position and attacked from an unexpected direction. The evaluator marked them as successful not because they followed the plan, but because they achieved the objective through initiative when the plan proved unworkable. September 12, 1943. Technical Sergeant Anthony Benedetto, who would later find fame as singer Tony Bennett, crouched in a foxhole near the German Gothic line in Italy and contemplated the fundamental difference between his worldview and that of the Wehrmacht soldiers 200 yards away. Benedetto had grown up in Queens, New York, son of Italian immigrants who'd come to America seeking opportunity. His father had run a grocery store, taught young Anthony that if you wanted something in life, you took action. You didn't wait for permission or perfect conditions. Now, wearing Army olive drab instead of grocer's apron, that same philosophy applied under fire. This cultural underpinning of American aggressiveness in combat often went unrecognized by military analysts focused on doctrine and training, yet it may have been the most important factor of all. America in the early 20th century was a nation built on individualism, entrepreneurship, and the conviction that bold action created opportunity. From Henry Ford's assembly lines to Thomas Edison's invention factories, American culture celebrated those who seized initiative and pushed boundaries. Children grew up hearing stories not of patient nobility but of pioneers, inventors, and self-made men who succeeded through audacity and hard work. Professor Samuel Huntington of Harvard University later wrote in his classic work, The Soldier and the State, published in 1957, that American military culture reflected the nation's broader liberal tradition emphasizing individual rights and skepticism toward hierarchical authority. While European armies could draw on feudal traditions where commoners naturally deferred to aristocratic officers, American forces operated in a society where theoretically any man might become president. This created a military that, while disciplined, encouraged junior personnel to question, suggest, and act independently in ways that would have seemed insubordinate in more traditional armies. The contrast became apparent whenever American forces operated alongside British Commonwealth troops. In Tunisia, during operations in April 1943, British officers noted with sometimes bemused, sometimes frustrated commentary that American soldiers treated their officers with considerably less formality. American privates spoke up in planning sessions, NCOs questioned tactical decisions, and junior officers routinely bypassed chain of command if they thought the situation demanded it. To British sensibilities, trained in regimental traditions stretching back centuries, this sometimes appeared as lack of discipline. But what looked like informality was actually a different kind of discipline, one based on mission accomplishment rather than procedural adherence. Corporal William Bradford, a clerk-turned-infantryman from Ohio, exemplified this mentality during the Italian campaign. When his platoon leader was killed during an assault on a German strongpoint, Bradford didn't wait for the chain of command to reorganize. He took charge of the nearest squad, assessed the situation, and led an immediate flanking attack that succeeded because it happened before German defenders could adjust to their initial success. Bradford received a Bronze Star, but more importantly, his actions weren't considered unusual. Dozens of similar incidents occurred wherever American forces fought, so common they rarely merited special mention in after-action reports. The immigrant composition of American forces reinforced these tendencies. While Britain drew primarily from its relatively homogeneous island population, American units included recent immigrants from Poland, Italy, Ireland, Germany, and dozens of other nations. These men had already demonstrated the boldness to uproot their lives and cross oceans seeking better futures. They'd already taken enormous risks, already embraced the American creed that fortunes favored the bold. Translating that mindset to combat came naturally. War became another frontier, another challenge to be met with aggressive action rather than passive waiting. November 8, 1942. Operation Torch lit the North African coastline as American forces made their first major amphibious assault against Axis-controlled territory, landing at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. For many American soldiers, this was their baptism by fire. And the patterns that would characterize American combat performance throughout the war emerged immediately. At Oran, harbor defenses should have made direct assault suicidal, yet US forces attacked the port facilities head-on rather than securing the surrounding area first. The assault cost heavy casualties, including the destruction of 2 Royal Navy cutters carrying US assault troops, but it also achieved rapid seizure of critical facilities before defenders could destroy them. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces, watched his untested American troops with a mixture of pride and concern. They made mistakes born of inexperience, poor camouflage discipline, inadequate reconnaissance, sometimes reckless bravery that bordered on foolhardiness. But they also demonstrated an aggressiveness that compensated for tactical deficiencies. When Vichy French forces resisted, American troops didn't bog down in positional warfare, but instead kept pressing forward, kept seeking flanks, kept attacking. Within 3 days, organized resistance collapsed, not because American forces were more skilled, but because they were relentlessly offensive in their orientation. The real test came months later when American forces first faced veteran German troops at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Axis forces, deliberately targeted American units he believed would crumble under professional Wehrmacht assault. Initially, his assessment seemed accurate, and experienced American forces fell back before German panzers and experienced infantry. But even in retreat, American soldiers kept fighting, kept counterattacking at squad and platoon level, kept trying to regain initiative. According to accounts preserved in the U.S. Army's official history, Northwest Africa, Seizing the Initiative in the West, published in 1957, German commanders expressed surprise at how quickly broken American units reformed and resumed offensive operations. Private First Class Audie Murphy, who would become America's most decorated soldier, experienced this pattern repeatedly during his service in Italy and France. At the Colmar Pocket in January 1945, Murphy's company was reduced to 19 men by sustained German attack. Rather than withdrawing to defensible positions, Murphy climbed onto a burning tank destroyer and used its machine gun to single-handedly break up a German infantry assault, then organized his surviving men for an immediate counterattack that recaptured lost ground. Murphy later wrote that he never considered retreat an option, not from bravado, but because his training and instinct both told him that aggressive action offered better survival odds than passive defense. This wasn't universal, of course. American forces had their share of poor units, failed attacks, and tactical defeats. At Hurtgen Forest from September 1944 through February 1945, American aggressive doctrine produced catastrophic casualties as troops attacked fortified German positions in dense woodland that negated American advantages in armor and air support. Over 33,000 casualties resulted from attacks that probably should have been reconsidered or redirected. Yet even this disaster revealed American military culture. Rather than shifting to defensive posture, commanders kept ordering attacks, kept seeking breakthrough, kept believing that aggressive action would eventually succeed. The contrast with Soviet tactics was equally instructive. Red Army doctrine also emphasized offensive action, but through mass and centralized control rather than individual initiative. Soviet attacks featured waves of infantry supported by concentrated artillery, with little room for junior leaders to deviate from plans. American aggressiveness operated at a much smaller scale, squad leaders making immediate decisions, individual soldiers identifying opportunities and exploiting them without waiting for permission. Both approaches were offensive-minded, but the American version distributed decision-making down to remarkably junior levels. February 19, 1945. Mount Suribachi loomed over Iwo Jima's black volcanic beaches as Marines of the 4th and 5th Divisions stormed ashore into one of the most heavily fortified positions in military history. Japanese defenders had spent months preparing 22,000 yards of tunnels, 1,500 cave positions, and interlocking fields of fire designed to inflict maximum casualties on any landing force. Standard military wisdom suggested extensive preliminary bombardment, perhaps weeks of sustained naval gunfire and air attacks to reduce defenses before risking amphibious assault. The Marines landed after only 3 days of preparatory fires and immediately attacked inland. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson of the 28th Marines didn't need to consult doctrine manuals to know what his regiment would do. They would attack. As his men scrambled across the beach through mortar and machine gun fire, Johnson moved forward with them, refusing to direct operations from the relative safety of a command post. "Casualties are high," he radioed back to division headquarters. "We're taking Suribachi. Not, we hope to take, not, we'll attempt, but a simple statement of intended fact." American forces would go forward regardless of cost because that's what American forces did. The battle for Iwo Jima would last 36 days and cost nearly 7,000 American lives, with another 20,000 wounded, nearly 40% casualties among the landing force. Yet throughout this grinding nightmare of underground warfare against fanatic defenders, American troops maintained offensive pressure. When frontal assault failed, they attacked from the flanks. When flanks were impossible, they attacked over the top. They used flamethrowers, demolitions, and small unit tactics to systematically destroy defensive positions, one cave at a time, never settling into static positions, never accepting stalemate. Sergeant John Bassalone, who'd already earned the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal, died on Iwo Jima's first day leading his machine gun section forward against Japanese bunkers. His last actions typified the American approach when pinned down by fire. He didn't hunker behind cover, but instead maneuvered through heavy fire to destroy the enemy position with grenades and small arms. Bassallone's death devastated his unit, but it also inspired them. Within hours, his surviving Marines had overrun the positions that killed him, driven forward by fury and the conviction that aggressive action honored their fallen sergeant better than cautious consolidation. In the Pacific theater, this aggressive American doctrine achieved results that more methodical approaches might not have. Japanese defensive doctrine assumed that Allied forces would follow European models, establish beachheads, consolidate positions, build up overwhelming force before advancing. American willingness to attack immediately, even at higher cost, consistently caught Japanese commanders off balance. At Tarawa in November 1943, Marines suffered appalling casualties crossing the reef and beach, but their immediate assault inland prevented Japanese defenders from organizing coordinated counterattacks that might have driven the landing force back into the sea. The island-hopping campaign exemplified American operational aggression at strategic level. Rather than systematically reducing every Japanese strongpoint, American forces bypassed heavily defended islands, leaving their garrisons isolated and irrelevant. This strategy required confidence that bypassed Japanese forces couldn't threaten American logistics, confidence born from the same aggressive mindset that drove tactical decisions. Douglas MacArthur's leapfrogging advance through the Southwest Pacific and Chester Nimitz's drive across the Central Pacific both reflected a preference for bold action over methodical reduction of enemy forces. Compare this with the more deliberate British campaign in Burma, where Commonwealth forces under William Slim fought brilliant campaigns, but at generally slower operational tempo, consolidating gains before advancing. Both approaches worked. Slim's 14th Army destroyed Japanese forces in Burma, while MacArthur and Nimitz advanced across the Pacific. But the American preference for speed and risk-taking allowed them to cover greater distances in less time, even if sometimes at higher immediate cost. April 25, 1945. American and Soviet forces met at Torgau on the Elbe River in Germany, symbolically cutting Nazi Germany in two. The meeting brought together two armies that had both fought their way across Europe, but with markedly different tactical philosophies. Soviet officers arriving at the link-up noticed immediately that American units seemed organizationally chaotic soldiers mixing freely with officers, decisions being made at company and platoon level that Red Army doctrine would reserve for divisional staff, and most strikingly a constant forward pressure, even when no specific objectives remained in the immediate area. By this late stage of the war, the American way of warfare had been refined through 3 years of hard combat across multiple theaters. The patterns that emerged on Normandy beaches were now codified in hard-won experience. American doctrine, as formally documented but more importantly as actually practiced by combat veterans, emphasized several key principles that distinguished it from Allied approaches. First, speed of action trumped perfect preparation. Second, junior leaders should seize initiative without waiting for detailed orders. Third, immediate counterattack upon contact was preferable to establishing defensive positions. Fourth, mission accomplishment mattered more than procedural correctness. British military observers had documented these differences throughout the war. Captain Basil Littlehart, the influential British military theorist, wrote extensive commentary on American tactical methods during and after the war. He noted that American forces accepted higher casualties in initial engagements, but often achieved objectives faster, which sometimes resulted in lower overall casualties for an entire operation. At Cannes, British forces ground forward methodically from June through August 1944, suffering steady attrition but maintaining organizational integrity. American forces broke out from St. Lay with Operation Cobra in late July, taking heavy initial losses but achieving operational breakthrough that shortened the entire campaign. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding British 21st Army Group, sometimes clashed with American commanders over these different approaches. Montgomery preferred set-piece battles with thorough preparation. He'd beaten Rommel at El Alamein by accumulating overwhelming force and attacking only when success was virtually certain. American commanders like George Patton represented the opposite philosophy: attack now with what you have, adjust based on results, maintain momentum at all costs. Both methods worked, but they reflected fundamentally different assumptions about acceptable risk and optimal use of military force. The German Wehrmacht, fighting its losing war on all fronts, adapted differently to each enemy. German defensive doctrine against Soviet attacks emphasized depth, mobile reserves, and counterattacks designed to blunt mass assaults. Against American forces, German commanders found they needed to focus on immediate local counterattacks, because American units that secured positions rapidly expanded them through aggressive patrolling and opportunistic advances. Wehrmacht after-action reports consistently noted that American forces required constant pressure. Left unmolested even briefly, they would attack. These doctrinal differences emerged not from any inherent superiority of one approach over others, but from different national experiences and military cultures. British forces carried centuries of professional military tradition, with regimental systems that preserved institutional knowledge and emphasized steadiness under fire. Soviet forces emerged from revolutionary ideology emphasizing mass mobilization and centralized control, adapted to the titanic struggle on the Eastern Front where entire army groups maneuvered across thousands of miles. American forces reflected a nation of immigrants, entrepreneurs, and individualists suddenly mobilized for global war, bringing cultural assumptions about initiative and innovation into military context. June 6, 1984. 40 years after D-Day, President Ronald Reagan stood at Pointe du Hoc overlooking Omaha Beach and honored the Rangers who'd scaled those cliffs under fire. His speech captured something essential about American military culture. These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war. The emphasis wasn't on following orders or maintaining formation, but on taking action, taking the cliffs, freeing the continent, ending the war through aggressive deed. The legacy of World War II's American tactical approach persisted through subsequent conflicts. In Korea, when Chinese Communist forces struck southward in November 1950, American units fought desperate delaying actions but consistently counterattacked rather than simply falling back. The Chosin Reservoir battle saw Marines surrounded by vastly superior numbers in bitter winter conditions. Yet their response was to attack in multiple directions simultaneously, what Oliver Smith called attacking in another direction. They didn't defend Chosin. They attacked their way out. Vietnam tested American aggressive doctrine under conditions it was poorly suited for counterinsurgency warfare, where traditional offensive operations often proved counterproductive. Yet even there, American tactical culture showed through. Small unit actions emphasized aggressive patrolling, immediate response to contact, and offensive sweeps rather than static defense. The disconnect came at strategic level, where aggressive tactics without clear political objectives produced mounting casualties without decisive results. The failure wasn't in American soldiers' willingness to fight offensively, but in the application of offensive doctrine to a conflict that required different approaches. By the time of Operation Desert Storm in 1991, American military doctrine had evolved to incorporate hard lessons from Vietnam while maintaining core emphasis on aggressive action. The air-land battle concept that guided the Gulf War featured deep strikes, rapid maneuver, and simultaneous operations at multiple levels, all expressing the same preference for offensive action that characterized American forces in World War II. When ground operations began in February 1991, American and coalition forces didn't grind forward methodically, but instead executed a massive flanking maneuver that covered hundreds of miles in 100 hours, maintaining pressure until Iraqi forces collapsed. The enduring question why Americans counterattacked immediately while other allies took cover first ultimately points beyond doctrine or training to something cultural and historical. From revolutionary beginnings through frontier expansion, through industrial innovation to global military power, American culture celebrated aggressive action, individual initiative, and the conviction that bold movement created opportunity while passive waiting invited defeat. This wasn't reckless abandon, it was calculated aggression, risk-taking tempered by pragmatism but never subordinated to excessive caution. Standing on those Normandy beaches decades after the guns fell silent, veterans remembered not the fear or the chaos, but the movement forward, the decision point where training and instinct combined to drive them toward the enemy rather than away. They remembered comrades who fell in those charges, but also the exhilaration of breakthrough, of German defenders retreating, of ground gained and held through sheer audacity. They carried forward a tradition born at Trenton and below Wood, refined through countless small actions on Pacific islands and European battlefields, handed down through generations of American soldiers who learned that when the shooting starts, Americans attack. That legacy continued into the 21st century through operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, where American forces consistently chose aggressive response over passive defense. Whether this approach remained optimal for counterinsurgency and peacekeeping operations remained debated, but the cultural underpinning persisted. Americans trained to take initiative, to counterattack immediately, to press forward rather than wait for circumstances to improve. It was, for better or worse, the American way of war, forged in revolution, tempered in civil war, and proven in 2 world wars when aggressive action helped liberate a continent and defeat totalitarianism. The thunder of those guns on D-Day echoed across decades, reminder that sometimes the most dangerous response to danger is hesitation, and that throughout history, Americans chose to run toward the sound of the guns rather than away from them.